the shadows of history, there is a war most Americans were never told about. A conflict with no formal declaration, no clear front lines, and no victory speech at the end. Thousands of US soldiers, pilots, and operatives went in quietly, and many never came home. Their missions were erased from headlines, their sacrifices buried in classified files. And for decades, the public barely knew this war even existed. Tonight on Clandestine Combat, you are stepping into that hidden battlefield where silence was a strategy and secrecy was survival. If stories like this matter to you, real history, untold sacrifice, and the truth behind covert wars, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because what you're about to hear is something few classrooms, documentaries, or history books fully explain. This was not a war fought with parades or public speeches. It was fought in dense jungles, remote mountains, and skies where aircraft flew missions that officially never happened. Orders were given in whispers. Maps were marked with places that did not exist on paper, and the men sent there understood one brutal reality. If they were captured, their country might never admit they were even there. Imagine flying combat missions where your uniform carried no flag, where rescue was uncertain, and where success could never be celebrated openly. Yet they kept flying. They kept fighting, because in the dangerous chessboard of the Cold War, stopping the spread of enemy influence sometimes meant fighting battles the public could never see. Every supply drop into hostile territory, every reconnaissance flight over enemy ground, every covert operation behind the lines carried enormous risk. Weather, terrain, and constant enemy fire turned routine missions into deadly gambles. Helicopters vanished into fog-covered valleys. Aircraft were shot down over regions that officially had no American presence. Families back home received quiet condolences instead of national recognition. And still, the missions continued, year after year, hidden behind diplomacy and deniability. This is the story of courage without credit, of loss without headlines, and of a war the United States never officially yet paid for in blood. To understand how this hidden conflict began, you have to step back into the tense, uncertain years after World War II, when the world split into rival spheres of power, and suspicion shaped every decision. Leaders feared that a single region falling under hostile control could trigger a chain reaction across continents. This fear did not always lead to open declarations of war. Instead, it produced something quieter and far more complicated: covert involvement, secret funding, and military action that operated just outside the public eye. American planners believed that if they waited for a formal war to begin, it might already be too late. So they chose a different path, one built on secrecy and plausible deniability. Advisors were sent first, described as trainers rather than combat troops. Equipment followed, labeled as defensive support rather than tools of war. Then came the pilots, intelligence officers, and special units whose missions blurred the line between assistance and direct fighting. On paper, the United States was not at war in this place. In reality, Americans were already risking their lives there every single day. Supply routes had to be protected, enemy movements had to be tracked. Friendly forces needed air cover when battles turned desperate. Each step pulled the country deeper into a conflict that officially did not belong to it. For the men on the ground and in the air, politics did not matter as much as survival. They learned to operate in unfamiliar terrain, where thick vegetation could hide danger just a few feet away, and where sudden attacks came without warning. Communication was fragile. Extraction was never guaranteed. Even the simplest mission could turn into a fight for life. Yet many of these service members believed strongly in what they were doing. They saw themselves as the thin line preventing a much larger and more destructive war. That belief helped them endure the uncertainty, the isolation, and the knowledge that their sacrifices might remain secret forever. Back home, ordinary Americans followed different headlines, focused on conflicts that had official names and televised briefings. The hidden war remained mostly invisible, discussed only in classified rooms and quiet military reports. But beneath that silence, the cost was already rising. measured in missing aircraft, wounded soldiers, and families waiting for answers that could not be fully explained. And, as the years passed, what began as a limited, unofficial effort slowly transformed into something far more dangerous: an undeclared war growing in the shadows, pulling the United States deeper than anyone had first imagined. As the conflict deepened, the missions grew more aggressive. What had once been labeled as advisory support quietly shifted into direct combat operations. American aircraft began flying over hostile territory at night, navigating mountains and valleys with minimal light, sometimes guided only by primitive instruments and raw instinct. Officially, these flights were described as logistical assistance. In reality, they were combat sorties, dropping supplies under fire, evacuating wounded allies, and, at times, engaging enemy positions to keep fragile front lines from collapsing. Pilots understood the risks better than anyone. They flew aging aircraft, pushed far beyond their design limits, landing on rough dirt strips carved out of jungle clearings or high mountain ridges. Anti-aircraft fire flashed upward from hidden positions. Missiles locked onto heat signatures in the dark. When a plane went down, there were no televised rescue operations. Search teams moved quietly, often days later, and sometimes they never found wreckage at all. Families back home might receive a brief notice that their loved one was missing during training exercises. The truth stayed classified. On the ground, special units operated in small teams, blending into remote regions where the lines between ally and enemy were constantly shifting. They trained local fighters, coordinated airstrikes, and gathered intelligence in villages that could change loyalty overnight. Trust was fragile. One wrong move could expose an entire network, yet these teams kept moving, carrying radios, maps, and the heavy weight of secrecy. They were fighting an enemy who knew the terrain intimately and who understood that if the conflict stayed unofficial, political pressure on the United States would remain limited. The cost began to rise steadily. Helicopters were shot down during rescue attempts. Convoys were ambushed on narrow jungle roads. Medical evacuations sometimes failed to arrive in time. Casualty numbers increased, but they rarely reached the front pages. Without a formal declaration of war, there were no dramatic speeches to rally the public. The conflict existed in a gray zone, real enough to kill, invisible enough to deny. And still, decision-makers in Washington believed that stepping back would create a power vacuum too dangerous to allow. They argued that this hidden battlefield was preventing a larger catastrophe elsewhere. So, funding continued. Operations expanded, and thousands more Americans rotated into a war their nation was not officially fighting, unaware that history would one day debate whether the silence surrounding it was strategy or mistake. By the late stages of the conflict, the battlefield had transformed into something even more dangerous. What began as limited, quiet involvement had evolved into a constant grind of missions that stretched men, machines, and morale to the breaking point. Air crews were flying multiple sorties a day. Ground teams rotated in and out of hostile zones, with barely enough time to rest. The enemy adapted quickly, studying flight patterns, predicting supply routes, and tightening their control over key areas. The element of surprise was fading, and every mission carried higher odds of not coming back. Weather became an enemy of its own. Thick fog swallowed entire valleys without warning. Sudden storms forced pilots to choose between turning back and abandoning allies or pressing forward through near-zero visibility. Many chose to press on. Some never emerged from the clouds. Mountains that looked manageable on a map turned into deadly obstacles in real life. One slight navigational error could send an aircraft into a and because these flights were unofficial, advanced support systems and large-scale search operations were limited. When something went wrong, help was often far away. On the ground, pressure intensified. Covert bases had to relocate frequently to avoid detection. Supply lines were constantly under threat. Intelligence officers worked long nights, piecing together fragments of information, trying to anticipate the next ambush or offensive. Trust between Allied local forces and American teams was tested again and again. Some allies fought bravely. Others were compromised, Every decision felt like a gamble with lives attached to it. Casualty lists quietly grew longer. Names were recorded, but explanations were carefully worded. Some deaths were attributed to accidents. Others were categorized under vague operational language. The families left behind often sensed there was more to the story, but details were locked away. Medals were sometimes awarded in small ceremonies without media coverage. The heroism was real, but the spotlight was absent. Yet, despite the rising toll, leadership remained convinced that the mission had strategic value. They believed pulling out would signal weakness and encourage further aggression elsewhere. So the operations continued, measured not by public speeches or victory parades, but by classified briefings and silent acknowledgments. The war that officially did not exist had become a relentless reality for those inside it, demanding sacrifice without recognition and courage without applause. As the years dragged on, the psychological toll became just as heavy as the physical danger. Fighting a war that your country would not publicly acknowledge created a strange kind of isolation. Service members rotated home for short breaks, sitting at dinner tables where friends and neighbors asked simple questions like, "So where were you stationed?" And they could not answer honestly. They offered vague explanations. Training missions, advisory roles, routine deployments. Inside, they carried memories of firefights, emergency landings, and the faces of teammates who never made it back. The secrecy that protected the mission also built a wall between these men and the society they served. There were no welcome-home parades, no major speeches honoring their campaign. Even within the military, details were many units did not fully understand what others were doing just miles away. Information was tightly controlled. Ni-2-no was the rule. That structure reduced leaks, but it also deepened the feeling that this conflict lived in the shadows. Meanwhile, the enemy grew more confident. They understood that as long as the war remained unofficial, political pressure inside the United States would stay limited. They fortified supply routes, expanded training camps, and improved anti-air defenses. Each improvement made American missions more dangerous. Aircraft losses increased. Rescue operations became riskier. Ground teams reported heavier resistance, yet public awareness remained low, and without headlines or nightly news coverage, there was little debate about the true costs. Behind closed doors, some officials began to question whether the strategy was sustainable. Was this shadow war truly preventing a larger disaster, or was it draining lives and resources without a clear path to victory? Others argued that abandoning the effort would erase years of sacrifice and hand a strategic win to the opposition. The debate intensified, but it stayed largely within classified rooms, far from public scrutiny. For the men still flying and fighting, those debates felt distant. Their reality was immediate. Check your gear, study the terrain, trust your team, complete the mission. Survive. Every sunrise meant another operation. Every radio call could signal trouble. And through it all, they held on to a simple belief. Even if the world did not know what they were doing, it mattered. Their commitment did not depend on recognition. It depended on each other and on the quiet understanding that history, one day, might finally uncover the truth of this hidden war. By this point, the scale of the conflict could no longer be called limited. Thousands of Americans had rotated through this hidden theater. Cargo pilots, fighter crews, mechanics, intelligence analysts, medics, special operators, and entire ecosystem of war, operating without the formal label of war. Airfields that did not officially exist were now running around the clock. Remote outposts became lifelines, supplying friendly forces who depended almost entirely on American support to survive. The air campaign intensified. Bombing runs targeted supply routes carved through jungles and mountains. Reconnaissance aircraft flew dangerous low-level missions, photographing enemy movements while dodging ground fire. Some flights crossed borders that were politically sensitive, areas where any public acknowledgement could spark international outrage. So when aircraft were hit, reports were carefully written, locations were generalized, details were sealed. Search and rescue became one of the most dangerous roles in the entire conflict. When a pilot was shot down, Teams launched quickly, racing against time before enemy forces reached the crash site. Helicopters flew into valleys known to be heavily defended. Gunners scanned tree lines for flashes of light that signaled incoming fire. Sometimes rescues succeeded in dramatic fashion, pulling injured airmen to safety under a storm of bullets. Other times, the rescue teams themselves were forced back, leaving behind men who would be listed as missing. Prisoners of war added another layer of complexity. If captured, these Americans existed in a gray zone. Publicly, their presence might not even be acknowledged. Negotiations were complicated by the fact that officially, the United States was not conducting combat operations there. Families waited years for confirmation. Some held on to hope long after the evidence suggested the worst. At home, the country was changing. Other conflicts dominated headlines. Social movements reshaped national conversations. But this quiet war continued, steady and relentless. Budget lines in defense spending concealed its true scope. Classified briefings updated select leaders on progress that was difficult to measure. Territory shifted back and forth. Tactical successes rarely translated into lasting stability. And still, the missions kept launching. Crews strapped in before dawn. Ground teams checked radios and ammunition one more time. Intelligence officers reviewed maps covered in markings that would never appear in public archives. Each day felt like a repetition of the last. Yet every day carried the possibility of sudden loss. The war without a declaration had become a long-endurance test of strategy, of secrecy, and of the human spirit under constant, unrecognized pressure. As losses mounted, the true weight of the conflict began to show in quieter ways. Units that had once deployed with confidence now carried a cautious edge. Veterans of multiple rotations moved differently, spoke less, and watched the horizon longer. They had learned that in this hidden war, danger rarely announced itself. It waited. It adapted. It struck when routine set in. The enemy understood American patterns better with each passing year. Supply drops were anticipated. Landing zones were informant networks were infiltrated. What had once been remote, safe havens slowly became contested ground. American teams had to move faster, operate lighter, and trust smaller circles. One compromised radio transmission could unravel months of careful planning. Technology improved on both sides, but it did not eliminate the uncertainty. Night vision equipment gave an advantage in darkness, yet dense terrain still swallowed entire patrols. Precision weapons reduced collateral damage, yet they could not guarantee strategic progress. For every tactical success, there seemed to be another setback waiting in the next valley. The conflict felt endless, not because of a lack of effort, but because the objectives themselves were difficult to define publicly. Without an official war aim, victory was measured in temporary stability rather than decisive outcomes. Morale became complicated. On one hand, strong bonds formed between those who served together. Shared danger builds loyalty quickly. On the other hand, the lack of recognition wore people down. When friends were lost, there were no nationally televised memorials. Sometimes even their full mission details could not be spoken at funerals. Grief had to exist within boundaries. Meanwhile, policymakers faced a narrowing set of options: escalate openly and risk a wider confrontation, or continue quietly and accept a steady stream of casualties. Neither choice promised a clean solution. Intelligence reports warned that withdrawing too quickly could undo years of effort and destabilize entire regions, but staying meant more names added to classified casualty lists. For the individuals still deployed, the strategic debate felt distant compared to the immediate mission. Secure the landing zone. Extract the team. Keep the aircraft in the air. Protect the convoy. Small objectives filled each day. Yet beneath that focus was a growing realization that this conflict might not end with a dramatic surrender or a clear victory. It might simply fade from public view, leaving behind thousands of stories that would take decades to fully surface. As the conflict stretched into years, something subtle but powerful began to shift. The question was no longer just whether the mission could succeed. The question was, how long the silence could hold. Reports from the field painted a complex picture. There were undeniable tactical victories, key supply routes disrupted, enemy offensives delayed, strategic positions secured just long enough to prevent immediate collapse. But none of it produced a final turning point. The war remained in motion, never fully tipping in one direction. Inside Washington, pressure slowly built. Some officials argued that continuing an undeclared war undermined public trust. Others warned that going public could trigger political backlash and embolden adversaries elsewhere. Intelligence briefings grew more urgent. Costs were carefully calculated, not just in dollars, but in lives. The numbers were sobering. Thousands dead, many more wounded, aircraft destroyed, families forever changed. And still, the official stance remained measured and limited. For the service members deployed, rumors of possible withdrawal created mixed emotions. Some longed for an end, for clarity, for acknowledgement. Others feared that leaving would mean the sacrifices of friends had been for nothing. Bonds formed in combat are not easily separated from purpose. When you fight beside someone in life or death moments, the mission becomes personal. It becomes about honoring those who fell. Enemy forces sensed hesitation. They increased pressure, launching coordinated attacks designed to test American resolve. Ambushes became more frequent. Defensive positions were probed repeatedly. The message was clear. Wait them out. The unofficial nature of the war, once seen as strategic flexibility, now looked like vulnerability. The longer it dragged on without public commitment, the more sustainable it became for the opposition. And then, slowly, the scale began to change. Missions were reduced. Certain outposts were closed. Air operations decreased in frequency. Public statements remained careful, framed around strategic adjustments rather than retreat. But for those on the ground, the meaning was obvious. The long shadow war was winding down not with a treaty signing or dramatic ceremony, but with quiet redeployments and dismantled bases. Equipment was packed, sensitive documents destroyed. Runways that had once roared with engines grew silent. The departure was controlled, professional, and subdued. Yet beneath that discipline was a deep awareness that something historic had just ended. On undeclared war that had consumed years of effort and thousands of lives, now fading without the recognition typically given to conflicts of such scale. When the last units rotated home, there was no clear moment that marked the end. No headline declaring victory. No official surrender broadcast across the world. The conflict simply slipped out of focus, replaced by new crises and new priorities. For the American public, it was easy to move on because most had never fully known the scope of what had happened. But for the veterans of that hidden war, the memories did not fade so quietly. Some returned to civilian life carrying physical wounds that required years of treatment. Others carried injuries no one could see. The strain of operating in secrecy, of losing friends without public acknowledgement, left a mark. Telling their story was complicated. Certain details remained classified. Some missions were still officially described in vague terms. Even reunions were careful about what could be shared openly. Over time, fragments of the truth began to surface. Declassified documents revealed the scale of operations. Historians pieced together flight logs, mission reports, and testimony from those who had served. The numbers shocked many who had assumed involvement was minimal. Thousands of casualties in a war that was never formally declared. Entire air campaigns conducted in regions where official statements had once denied combat presence. The hidden conflict slowly entered public awareness, but decades later, when the urgency had already passed. For families who had lost loved ones, the delayed recognition brought mixed emotions. Pride in knowing the full extent of sacrifice. Frustration that acknowledgement had taken so long. Some names were finally added to memorials. Some missions were publicly honored at last, yet there was no way to fully restore what had been taken years of life. Futures interrupted. Children who grew up without parents. Strategically, debates continue even now. Some argue the covert effort prevented wider instability and bought critical time during a tense global standoff. Others believe the costs outweighed the gains. That secrecy limited accountability and prolonged a conflict without a clear end state. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, shaped by context, fear, and the unpredictable nature of global politics. But beyond strategy and policy, what remains undeniable is this. Thousands of Americans served in a war their country never officially fought. They flew, marched, planned, and sacrificed under conditions that demanded courage without applause. And whether history labels the conflict a success or a mistake, their commitment cannot be erased. Their story deserves to be told clearly, without distortion, and without silence. So, when we look back at this hidden chapter of history, the question is not just why it happened, but what it teaches us. A nation can commit enormous resources, send thousands of its people into danger, and still avoid the word war. It can operate in shadows for strategic reasons, believing that secrecy protects larger interests. But secrecy also has a cost. It can delay accountability, it can isolate those who serve, and it can leave generations unaware of sacrifices made in their name. The men who fought in this undeclared conflict did not choose the political framework around them. They followed orders. They trusted their leaders. They relied on each other. In cockpit after cockpit, in remote outposts carved from unforgiving terrain, in briefing rooms filled with maps that never appeared in textbooks, they showed up and did their job. Some came home with stories they could not fully tell. Others never came home at all. Losing thousands in a war that officially did not exist forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Power does not always move in public. Decisions made behind closed doors can shape battlefields far from cameras, and the absence of a declaration does not make bullets less deadly or losses less real. For the families who received folded flags, the technical status of the conflict did not change their grief. On Clandestine Combat, our mission is simple. Bring these hidden stories into the light with clarity and respect. Not to sensationalize them, not to push an agenda, but to make sure the silence does not erase the people who lived it, because history that stays buried cannot teach us anything. If this story changed how you see America's past, I want to hear from you. Do you think covert wars are sometimes necessary to prevent something worse? Or do you believe that if a nation fights, it should always do so openly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and respectful debate keeps these conversations alive. And if you found value in this deep dive, share this video with someone who cares about military history or untold stories. That simple action helps more people discover what really happened. Make sure you resubscribed so you don't miss the next episode, where we uncover another operation that history nearly forgot, because some wars are loud and unforgettable. Others are quiet, complicated, and easy to overlook. But every single one leaves a mark. And the war the United States never officially fought yet lost thousands of men and deserves to be remembered.